It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs. Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy in my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on Current Initiatives. And now, to our guest. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast, sponsored by the Finding Genius Foundation.
I have Dr. Thomas Stafne. He's an extension research professor at Mississippi State. We're going to talk about fruit crops like blueberries, blackberries, grapes, etc. So we're going to talk about that, fruits and nuts, etc. So, Eric, thanks for coming.
Oh, you're welcome. Glad to be here.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background and how you got into this area of horticulture, agriculture, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, that's a good question about, how does one get to where one is later in life? And I guess kind of my interest started in forestry, and that's what I studied as an undergraduate. But in the studying that, my interest was kind of more aligned to urban forestry or agroforestry, which were different angles on the traditional type of forestry. And so I was able to implement some of that when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Senegal. So I worked with trees, but also with fruit trees and gardens and that sort of stuff there. And that's kind of really brought me to horticulture. And from that point, I got interested in fruit crops specifically. And so I went ahead and studied that in graduate school. And that was kind of where I headed along the track. I was lucky enough to stay with fruit crops as I progressed in my career.
Okay. So out of the fruit crops, which ones, I don't know, have you had the most experience with? Have you grown the most?
Yeah. Early in my career, I did a lot with grapes, especially wine grapes and table grapes. And then I've kind of transitioned to blueberries and blackberries. I still work with grapes and muscadines. And now I kind of have added passion fruit to my cadre of things that I work with. But it's still, throughout my career, which has now been 17 years as a professor of some level or other, I've worked with all of these crops at some point.
So let's say for, a beginner, what would be the easiest fruit crop or nut crop that they could grow and why?
Yeah, well, some of that depends on where you're located. If you've got particular growing conditions, if I'm in South Mississippi, so we're not that far from the Gulf Coast. Conditions are very rainy and humid, lots of fungal pressure. So you're looking at things like blueberries or muscadines are, somewhat easier to grow. Pecan would be a nut crop. But in other areas of the country, that may not be the case, or that, other things might be easier to grow in some place like the West Coast. So where we might have problems with certain types of wine grapes, they grow great along the West Coast, So a lot of that does depend on the conditions that you're growing in.
Well, right. Makes sense. What's some of the fastest things that you can grow I know like a lot of nuts and fruits, it takes multi-years for them to produce.
Yeah, absolutely. The something like blackberries, or if you're in an area that can grow them, raspberries. Those are quick turnaround crops. You plant them, then you're going to start getting a little bit of fruit the next year, and by the third year, you're getting quite a bit of fruit. Blueberries are fairly quick. You're getting something by the third year, and by the fifth year, you're in full production. Grapes are kind of on a similar time scale to that. So a lot of these crops that are woody, that create a lot of kind of plant architecture, those take a little bit longer. The fruit trees that you're talking about, peaches or pecans or apple trees, those can take much, much longer. They can take 5 years. In some cases, pecan tree, it may be 10 years before you're getting some sort of good production. So, with small fruit crops, you can reduce that to a shorter time cycle and get things that are much quicker turnaround.
Has anyone been able to figure out how to get fruit trees or nut trees to produce faster? Or does anyone understand the clocks that govern, how the tree knows, quote unquote, oh, it's year 3. All right, it's time to produce fruit or not?
Well, some of that can be modified, okay, through grafting onto a rootstock. That can modify that time frame some. But these, some things like fruit trees, peach tree, and then you've grafted it onto a rootstock, well, you're taking a mature part of that tree and placing it on that rootstock. You can get a faster production turnaround by doing that. But some of these trees, if you're growing it from a seed, which fruit trees are generally not done, except for something like maybe you're doing a pecan tree, and those are mostly grafted. It has to go through this juvenile phase where it's developing the root system, it's developing a canopy size. It has to, have enough plant infrastructure there in order to accumulate nutrients and redistribute those, and also the hormones that would initiate things like fruit production.
Well, again, has anyone characterized why some of these plants will grow in, again, year 3 or year 5, but not a year earlier? Like, how consistent is that? For I don't know, let's say peaches, I think, are 5 years. Are there plants that will do it in 3 or 4 or 6, or is it always 5 years? And if so,
No.
has anyone studied this process?
Yeah, it's I'm not aware of that studies that have been done in that area, but there are differences among varieties and differences in that precocious fruiting. So I'm probably more familiar with something like in pecan trees where there's a huge difference. So a variety that's precocious, maybe like a Pawnee, would be 6 years, whereas you're talking about something like a Stewart variety might be 10 years. So there are these differences. Why those occur, I'm not sure why that happens, and I haven't done research in that area. My research is not aligned with that, but the breeders would look for that in terms of precocious fruiting and select away from those varieties that have long fruiting initiation cycles. So it can be something that's selected for.
So what are some of the research questions that you're trying to answer in regards to the stuff that you grow?
Yeah, being an extension, most of my research tries to be very applied. So it tries to answer a question that a grower might have, something of how to grow, blueberries better, or, how to produce more blackberries in the field, and those sort of things. So, one example that I get is in Mississippi, we have a lot of old blueberry plantings that haven't been kept up. So in that case, with these rabbit-eyed blueberries, which are more native type species that we grow down here, they can get quite large and they get overgrown. They get a lot of dead wood in them. And so productivity goes down. So somebody may come along and buy that field and want to revitalize it. And the question becomes, well, how do I do that? And so there hasn't been a lot of research done on that. So I took that idea and did some research recently where we cut the bushes back to different levels. Some prior recommendations that cut them all the way off at the ground and let them resprout. And there was other recommendations in other places that say, no, cut them back up to a certain height. So what we did was three different things. We cut them back at the ground. We cut them back at about 2 feet high. And then we added another treatment, phosphorus acid, to the soil, hoping that might provide some sort of beneficial impact to the plant to make them fruit quicker or grow faster. Now, the phosphorus acid had no effect at all, but the pruning did. So bushes that were cut at the ground level took longer to come into production than those that were cut at 2 feet tall. So the ones that were cut at 2 feet produced more shoots and produced more flowers and fruit faster than those that were cut at the ground.
What do you mean you snipped off the branches below 2 feet? Or you snipped off the branches above 2 feet? What do you mean you cut
the trunk? We left 2 feet of the trunk from the ground up. So everything else came off. And it was, you could just cut it off with a chainsaw at 2 feet tall. And so then at that point, it resprouts. And we did this. The key to doing this is early enough in the season, in the summer, that you can get that it can resprout and grow during the rest of the summer and into the fall, set flower buds and fruiting buds for the next year. And so that means if somebody can start harvesting in the next year and get a significant amount of fruit, then that's obviously an economic return that's valuable for someone who's trying to make a living doing it.
So you said when you trimmed up to 2 feet and then the foliage started, then it worked better. But if you left it too low, they didn't grow as well, the trees?
Yeah, if we cut them off at the ground level, just left nothing, and had them resprout from the roots, it took longer. So it's not to say that it wasn't, in the long term was good, but the chances for getting economic return earlier were not as good because they took much longer to produce growth that was adequate for producing fruit.
Well, do you think any of this has to do with the sun being able to reach down through the canopy? If it was too low, given that there's other trees around, maybe that's why it took longer to grow?
No, I think what it is probably what it is with stored energy within the trunk that was left. So there's wood there, and that has energy stored in it. It's got nutrients, carbohydrates, sugars, water, all that stuff is still there. And there's buds along that trunk that can be pushed out to create new growth. Whereas if you cut all of that off and just left it from the roots, they would have to push up the new growth from just the root system, and it couldn't take advantage. What I see what you're saying is they couldn't take advantage of photosynthesis as quickly because it takes longer to push that new growth, create the leaves, and to kind of drive the whole process of feeding itself their sunlight. So yeah, that probably does have some sort of factor to it.
Okay. Another question. I don't know if you know this, but let's say I don't know what trees are you very familiar with, or plants, blueberries, or what are some of the fruits that you know the most about?
Well, the ones I know most about are probably blueberries and blackberries and grapes.
So how long if I grow a blueberry bush or blackberry bush, how long does it take for them to produce the blackberries or blueberries, and then how many years will they produce until they stop?
Yeah. So with the blueberry, it can vary some because there's different kinds of blueberries, and we have rabbit eye blueberries, which we grow here. We also have southern high bush blueberries, which we grow here in Mississippi. There are regular high bush blueberries, which are grown in more northern parts of the country. So for us, a southern high bush blueberry would come into production within the third year, you would get about 5 years of good production, and then it would start to decline because it's disease factors, insect factors, just overall, it's just not as thrifty of a plant when we compare it to a rabbit-eye, which is a different species, but it's native to this region. So again, it would take about 3 years to get production, but those plants can live for decades and keep producing as long as management is good because they're more adapted to our environment. They're more resistant or tolerant to most of the diseases and insects that we have. So that provides them, a better adaptation to our region and therefore better long-term production.
Well, yeah, what I was going to ask you is, so if like a blueberry bush, produces in year X and then produces, let's say, for 5 years, what are how the blueberries different in the first year that they're produced, let's say, versus the last year? Because I don't know, I would think their composition will be different, their flavor profile, their nutrient profile, what's been observed.
Right. I don't know the results offhand. Here's what I would expect. Because you have a smaller plant, you have less of a developed root system, you have fewer leaves. My guess, is that you're going to have probably fruit that might, and I'm just going to say might, be less sweet or maybe a little bit smaller than an older plant. However, there's another factor there, is if you have fewer fruit on the plant, you have less competition for the resources that are there. So, if there's enough resources to go around, it could be the same size or the same sweetness as you get later on in a plant that has more fruit. So, would you expect maybe a little bit of difference between earlier and later? Yeah, I would say possibly, but it's not something that most, especially in blueberries or blackberries, most growers are probably not going to have a really noticeable difference. Now, where I've heard more of that being discussed is with wine grapes, and that younger vines just don't create as good a vintage as older vines just because of their, they haven't developed the root system, the canopy system is not as developed. And so the sugars and the acids and all that are not as well balanced early on as they are later on in the vine's life.
Okay. So what are some of the new, again, research topics that you're working on in terms of, blueberries and blackberries and other plants? Are you just trying to, maximize yield, or, what are some of the things that you're working on?
Yeah. In terms of blueberries and blackberries, I kind of look for things that are creating issues for growers. And one of the things in blackberries I've been doing is we have this abiotic issue called white druplet disorder. It's caused by high heat conditions, or at least we think that's what it's caused by. But it's also a genetic factor in there. So different varieties respond differently. And what it is a blackberry is made up of all these little bitty druplets. Okay, so it's an aggregate fruit. Each one of those has a seed inside of it. But sometimes, if the conditions are right or wrong, depending on how you look at it, it will turn a whitish color instead of being black. Why this occurs, we know that it's genetically driven. Different varieties have different levels of this expression, and the environment. So it appears that hot weather, especially drastic changes in from going from cool to hot weather, may drive this. And so what I've done is try to look at different ways to mitigate that for growers. And one way to do that we found is that if you provide shade over top of the plant, it almost reduces that problem entirely. And which is a good thing, except that shade structures cost money, and there may be other factors in there too that limit the application of that. So if you're really concerned about it, yes, you can provide shade. It eliminates that problem. Another thing that we tried is adding more nitrogen. And what we found is that over time, we did this for 3 years, that if we doubled the amount of nitrogen that we gave to the plant, it did reduce over a 3-year period the amount of these white drupelets that showed up in a highly susceptible variety. And so, again, that's another thing where you're saying, well, the application of this, is that economically feasible with the prices of fertilizer? Is it environmentally feasible by adding, more fertilizer to the soil? So, those are things that we're just kind of trying to look for answers and give growers options. So those are a couple things I've worked with there. And then also what I've been devoting time to in the last couple of years is working with passion fruit, trying to look maybe somewhat forward with our changing environment, getting warmer. Are we going to be able to grow things that we previously could not grow here? So passion fruit's one of those things I've looked at. And I've been also breeding with the native passion fruit that we have to introduce a little bit more cold hardiness, maybe a little more precocious fruiting to it as well. So that's something I worked with a couple of years.
I don't know, any big events coming for, growing these type of trees, fruits and nuts? Any research that's in the works that holds a lot of promise to dramatically change it? Or is it going to be just a slow, steady improvement and, trying different things and selective breeding to get us where we want to go?
Yeah, that's, the breeding aspect of this is something that takes a long time. So in most of these fruit crops, it can take from the time you make a cross to when a new variety is released, it can be about 10 years with, a small fruit crop like a blueberry or a blackberry. And if you're talking, a tree fruit or a pecan, it can be decades before you get to a new variety. So, these things take a lot of time. When there's, of course, a lot of new technologies out there, the GMO type things, the CRISPR technologies that can potentially help speed that up. But they're still kind of, in the infancy or early stages of being useful for breeding in certain crops. So there's a lot of unknowns in those sort of things. So, in our world of fruit, there's not necessarily things that just come out and make a huge impact. It's more kind of a slow thing. Although, one of the things that I think we're seeing in blackberries that's making a huge impact is something called primocane fruiting, or another name is fall fruiting blackberry. So for almost the entire existence of humans growing blackberries, this trait did not exist. And but it was found and developed and cultivated by University of Arkansas. And now they've released some varieties that actually can produce 2 crops in a year. This was common or more common in raspberries, but not in blackberries. So now we have blackberries that will produce potentially 2 crops in a year, one in the spring and one in the. And so that gives a huge, advantage for growers who can produce that sort of thing. The downside is in areas like where I live and work, it's not really viable because the flowering, the fruiting for the fall crop occurs in the middle of summer. And when it's 95 degrees with high humidity, that's not good for flowers. So the flowers tend to essentially burn up and not be able to be pollinated at that temperature. And so we don't get the good fall crops. But in places on the West Coast, Oregon, California, that can be somewhat, changed by having more moderate. So that's probably the biggest development that I'm aware of in small fruit crops recently.
Right, gotcha. Okay. What's the reason for doing passion fruit? It's just a new one that you think would be, in the U.S., I don't know how much passion fruit is grown, any, or is it all imported, or is this new?
Yeah, that's a good question because, it's not well known. I think that the reasons I kind of chose it is, one is kind of I have a personal interest in it, but 2, I see that there's a lot more interest in the marketplace for this particular crop. People of Hispanic origin or culture know of this crop. And so we are seeing an increase in that population within the United States. So the familiarity is there. And as I mentioned before, our climate is warming, and we're able to grow things that we can't grow before. Now, currently, passion fruit is grown commercially in South Florida and some in California, Southern California, and Hawaii and Puerto Rico. So those are the areas where most of it is grown. There's a little bit, grown here and there in other places, South Texas and other places like that, trying it. But even so, there's not a lot being grown. And most of it that we get is imported as a juice or a concentrate from other places. So, the center of origin for passion fruit is in South America. So, they have lots and lots and lots of it that they grow there. They process it and they send it to us fairly cheaply as a processed product. But almost all of what's grown currently in the U.S. is for fresh market. So some would buy it and just eat it as a fresh product. So I think the potential is there to grow that market and make it something that we can have at least a somewhat of a niche market in different southern states where they don't get froze out. Because the vines that are tropical in nature, but like I said, I'm breeding with some more cold hardy plant material that hopefully we can kind of increase the area we can grow these particular plants.
Okay. As an extension agent, do you have a big grow on campus that students help out with, or like where are the plants that your husband located at, and whoever sees them?
That's a great question. The way that the extension system it kind of works is that we collaborate with the research. So the university has an extension branch, it has a research branch, it has a teaching branch. And so they're all working together in some way. And so the research branch has experiment stations across the state. And many states have this same type of system. So I actually am not on campus. I'm about 3.5 hours drive south of campus on an experiment station. That is where we grow the plants. So we grow blueberries and blackberries and passion fruit and grapes and muscadines and all those sort of things on our experiment stations. And that's where we do the research at. That's where we host things like workshops and field days and educational events as well, to bring the public in to see what we're doing.
Well, how often can the public come see, and what does that look like? Do they get training, or they just come see for an hour, or at Mississippi State? Is there a big program for students?
Well, the thing about it's very difficult for students because we're so far away from campus. So we do have graduate students, so students who are getting their master's degree or PhD. They are housed here. They work here with us. The undergraduate student, that's a different thing because it's so far away from campus. But yeah, so those students can work with us. We host these types of events for the public as educational things, and they can look differently depending on what the key aspect is we're trying to convey. So we might hold something like a pruning workshop, so where I'd go and I'd talk about pruning grapes or blueberries or whatever, and then demonstrate it, and then they could ask questions, and then they would have the opportunity to go out and practice themselves on something. And pruning is one of those things where people are kind of afraid that they might prune it wrong. So if we show them right and then they can do it, that's a really good and satisfying aspect of extension, to be able to have people to do that. And then something like
lost you for a quick second. Yeah, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work? I don't know if you have any videos online, or what kind of materials can people see about the stuff you're growing and the advice you give?
Yeah, the Mississippi State University Extension has a website.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are 1 or 2 useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated? due to automation. Please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about their Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.